If you want to stay in this family, you'll sign that by the time we cut the cake. Otherwise, I'll have my son's attorney make a very uncomfortable call Monday morning." My mother-in-law didn't raise her voice when she said it. She never did. Nadine Ashford had spent 30 years learning how to make a threat sound like advice, how to wrap a knife in the language of concern. She sat at the head of the Christmas dinner table in that enormous house in Westchester, hands folded over her napkin, looking at me the way you look at a contractor who has delivered something slightly below specification. The document was sitting next to the breadbasket. 11 pages, printed on paper that felt like it cost more than my first car. A postnuptial agreement drafted by the kind of attorney whose retainer alone would cover my mother's rent for 8 months. Someone had placed a pen beside it, not handed it to me. Placed it. The way you place a fork, like it was already decided. My husband, Elliot, was sitting directly across from me. He was doing the thing he did when he needed to disappear without actually leaving the room, studying the centerpiece, a spray of white pine branches and gold ribbon that his mother had probably paid someone $300 to arrange. He hadn't looked at me since we pulled through the iron gates 2 hours ago. He hadn't looked at me, I think, since he'd found out about this dinner. His father, Lawrence, was at the other end of the table, cutting his prime rib with the patience of a man who considers waiting the same thing as winning. His sister, Kendall, was doing something with her phone under the table, pretending she wasn't watching me. Her husband, the one who had gone to Columbia Law and mentioned it the way other people mention their eye color, was refilling his wine glass and smiling at nothing in particular. This was Christmas at the Ashfords. This was what I had married into 2.5 years ago, when I was 29 and still operating under the belief that love was a good enough foundation to build anything on. Before I tell you what I slid across that table in return and why, 40 minutes later, my father-in-law's face had gone the color of old chalk. Tell me where you're watching from. Drop it in the comments. Because this is a story about what happens when the people who decided what you were worth did it without checking their math. Have you ever sat at a table full of people who were smiling at you and simultaneously deciding your future? If you have, stay with me. Because the prime rib was getting cold, and I had not driven 2 hours in December traffic to leave without saying what I came to say. Nadine set down her fork. She looked at me with the expression she reserved for things that required patience, late florists, underperforming charities, me. "Jessa," she said, making my name sound like a minor inconvenience she'd agreed to accommodate. "I hope you understand this isn't personal. The Ashford family has obligations that go back 3 generations. Lawrence's grandfather built something that we have a responsibility to protect. What we're asking is simply reasonable." "You're asking me to sign away my marital rights," I said. "At the Christmas dinner table, next to the rolls." Kendall looked up from her phone. She had a particular smile she used on me, the one that said she found me charming in the way you find a child's drawing. Charming, with complete condescension dressed up as warmth. "No one is trying to diminish you," she said. "We just think that given your background, certain protections make sense. You came into this family with a very different situation than Elliot's. That's not a judgment, it's just the reality. Your background." Those 2 words had followed me around that house since the day Elliot first brought me to meet them. My background. Meaning the house in Akron, Ohio where I grew up, the one that needed a new roof for 6 years before we could afford it? Meaning my mother, who worked double shifts at the hospital as an LPN for 20 years without once complaining about it. Meaning the full ride I'd gotten to Ohio State because there was no other way I was going. And the way I'd learned to stop mentioning it after I realized that Ashfords heard full scholarship and translated it automatically to poor. They had never asked what I did for work. Not really. Not with actual curiosity. Elliot had told them early on that I worked in tech, something with software, and Nadine had nodded with the particular expression of someone filing information under not relevant. The subject had closed. I was a pretty girl from nowhere who had married their son, which meant I was either a romantic mistake or a financial liability, and in either case, I required management. They weren't entirely wrong about being strategic. They had just made an error about which one of us was the one playing a long game. "I'm not signing it," I said. The table went quiet in the way rooms go quiet, when something is shifted and everyone is still deciding what the shift means. Elliot finally looked at me. His expression had 3 things in it at once: guilt and a warning, and something underneath both of them that I recognized as the look of a person who knows he has been making small compromises for so long that he can no longer clearly identify where the larger one happened. "Jessa," he started. "I'm not signing it," I said again at the same volume with the same tone. I had been practicing that tone since I got into the car at our apartment in Brooklyn. The one that doesn't argue. The one that just states. Lawrence set down his knife. Then I need you to understand what that means. Our attorney is available Monday morning. A postnuptial refusal can be considered in divorce proceedings, and if it comes out that there were misrepresentations about your circumstances when you entered this marriage. Misrepresentations, I said. We've done our due diligence, said Kendall's husband. His name was Griffin, and he had a face built for delivering bad news in the language of reasonableness. We know what your company filed last year. We know the revenue. He paused, which I suspected he had also practiced. $43,000. We're not here to embarrass you. We're here to protect the family. I looked at Griffin for a moment. He had gone to Columbia Law. I knew this. I also knew that he had a habit of using Ashford family connections to accelerate client referrals in ways that sat at a complicated angle to the New York Bar Association's ethical guidelines, and that 3 of those referrals had gone through a consulting firm that had been, as of 14 months ago, acquired by a holding company I controlled. But I didn't say that. Not yet. 43,000, I said. That's what the filing showed. Yes, Griffin said, with the satisfaction of a man holding a hand he considers unbeatable. Pull up Solace Technologies, I said. You can use your phones. It's fine. Nobody moved. Please, I said, and the word was so precisely placed that Kendall actually reached for her phone before she caught herself and stopped. We're not going to, Nadine started. Solace Technologies, I said again. SOLACE. I'll wait. Elliot picked up his phone. I watched him type. I watched him read. I watched something leave his face. Not color, exactly. More like certainty. The specific certainty of a person whose picture of things has been accurate for so long that it never occurred to them to check it. What is this? He said. Not a question. The sound of a sentence colliding with something it hadn't expected to find. Lawrence frowned at his son, then at his own phone. Nadine looked at Lawrence with the expression of a woman who has never had to look anything up and considered the act of doing so a minor defeat. Griffin's jaw shifted. Kendall went very still. Solace Technologies was not the name on my business cards. I didn't have business cards for it. It was the parent entity, the structure that sat above the structures that sat above the things people could actually see and name. I had built it that way, not to be mysterious, but because, when you are building something real, you don't need it to be legible to people who aren't looking. The last public coverage of Solace Technologies had been a piece in Wired 18 months ago, which had put the valuation at $1.8 billion. The Ashford family's total holdings, the Westchester estate, the commercial properties in Hartford, Lawrence's investment portfolio, came to approximately $340 million. I knew this because I had reviewed their financials during the due diligence process, before one of my subsidiaries offered their property management company a refinancing line of credit 3 years ago. They knew the name of the lender. They didn't know who owned it. That's not, Lawrence started. Possible, I offered. I know. Nadine's face did something I had not seen it do before. Not shock. She was too controlled for visible shock, but a recalculation. The expression of someone who has been running a formula for years and has just discovered a variable they hadn't included. You've been building this since before you and Elliot? I founded Solace when I was 26, I said. The $43,000 that Griffin mentioned is a subsidiary I used for administrative overhead. It has nothing to do with the operating company. I picked up the postnuptial agreement and held it. I understand why this exists, I said. You looked at me and made a decision, and then you spent 2.5 years operating on that decision without revisiting it. That's not unusual. People do that. The problem is that the decision was wrong. How, Elliot said. Just that word. The way you say a word when you're not asking for information but for time, because you need a moment to reorganize everything. I didn't hide anything from you, I said, and I meant it. I had told Elliot I had a company. I told him it was growing. On our second date, walking along the High Line in November, I told him that I had built something I believed in and that I intended to make it last. He had smiled. He had said that was great. He had not asked what it was called or what it did or what growing meant in numbers. And I hadn't offered because I had learned by then that when you are a woman with something real, people either don't believe you or they make it the only thing they see, and neither of those felt like the beginning of something honest. I had wanted Elliot to know me first. That was the mistake I kept returning to, sitting at that table. Not his family. I had known about his family from the beginning, had made my peace with their particular flavor of inherited arrogance. The mistake was assuming that knowing me first would be enough. That 2 years of a real marriage would outweigh 30 years of conditioning. Let me go back a little, because I think you need to understand who I was before that table. My mother raised me in a house where the heat went out twice in winter, and you just wore more sweaters and didn't discuss it with anyone at school. Not because we were ashamed, she wasn't built for shame, but because she had a fierce, practical belief that your business was your own until you chose to share it, and that most people would misuse what you gave them anyway. She worked the night shift at the hospital 4 days a week for most of my childhood. She called it paying the future forward. She didn't mean money. She meant me. I got into computer science at Ohio State on a full academic scholarship. I went because I was good at building things that didn't exist yet and needed to exist. I coded my first functional product at 23, in a studio apartment in Columbus with a space heater that turned off every 40 minutes, eating ramen and turkey sandwiches and running the same simulation 17 times until it worked. I launched Solace at 26 with 2 employees, 1,000 square feet of office space in Nashville, and enough conviction to terrify most people who heard the pitch. By the time I met Elliot at a conference in Chicago, Solace had 48 employees and 3 enterprise clients in the healthcare logistics space. I was 39 days away from closing a Series B round that would value the company at just under $200 million. I had not slept a full night in 4 months. I had spilled coffee on myself in the hotel elevator and was still wearing it when I walked into the conference reception, and Elliot had handed me a cocktail napkin without making a joke about it. And I had thought, that's either genuine or very practiced, and I want to find out which. It was genuine. That part I got right. What I underestimated was the weight of his family, not the money. I had my own, and it wasn't a competition. The weight of the story they had built about themselves, and the way Elliot had been living inside that story his whole life, so long that he couldn't always tell the difference between their version of him and his own. The Christmas before last, 18 months into our marriage, Nadine had taken me aside after dinner. Into the room she called the sitting room, which was large enough to be a conference space and had a piano no one played. She had sat across from me and said in that same quiet voice she used for everything, "Jessa, I want to be straightforward with you because I think that's more respectful than being indirect. Elliot has always been generous. That's one of his best qualities. But generosity in a person can be a vulnerability when the people around them don't have the same values. I'm not making accusations. I'm simply telling you that this family pays attention. We always have." I had driven home that night and told Elliot what she'd said. He had listened and then said, "That's just how she talks. She doesn't mean it the way it sounds." He had said that 11 times in 2.5 years. I had counted. I came back to the table, to the silence, to the document on the white tablecloth. "There's something else," I said. "And I want to be honest here, because I have thought about what I did next for a long time, and I am not entirely sure it was clean. It was not the behavior of someone who had risen above it. It was the behavior of someone who had waited, specifically and deliberately, for the right moment, and had decided that this was it." I reached into my bag and took out a folder. Manila, letter-sized, nothing special. I set it on the table next to the postnuptial agreement. 2 years ago, I said, the Ashford Property Group took out a commercial credit line to refinance 4 of your Connecticut holdings. $11.5 million. The lender was Harwick Capital Partners. I looked at Lawrence. Last spring, I completed an acquisition of a controlling interest in Harwick Capital, which means, as of that acquisition, I hold the note on your credit line. I opened a folder and slid a single page across the table. You missed a payment in October. Technically, the wine is in default. Not significantly. But technically. Lawrence stood up. "Sit down, Lawrence," I said, and the instruction was so quiet, so completely without performance, that he actually stopped moving. He stood for a moment, then sat back down. Which surprised both of us, I think. "I'm not calling it in," I said. "I want to be clear about that. I have no interest in your properties. I have no interest in your business. What I have is documentation, and what I want is for everyone at this table to understand what the actual math looks like when you run it correctly." I looked at Griffin. "Since we're apparently doing due diligence." Griffin's expression had changed. He was looking at the folder the way you look at something that has started moving when you were certain it was stationary. "The referral arrangement you've been running through Ashford Family Contacts," I said, turning to face him directly, "has generated client placements for 3 of your firm's partners over the past 2 years. Those placements went through an intermediary, Pelham Advisory Group. Pelham was acquired by a Solace subsidiary in August. Their internal communications are now part of our standard compliance review." I let that sit for a moment. I shared the relevant documentation with the New York Bar Association's Ethics Division 4 days ago. Kendall turned to look at her husband. The look people give when they are revising a sentence they've been saying for years. Griffin opened his mouth. Nothing came out. I want to be clear, I said to the table, that I did not plan tonight. I did not arrange for any of this to coincide with Christmas dinner. I did not engineer this. You called this dinner. You put that document next to the breadbasket. You chose tonight. I just came prepared. Nadine looked at me for a long time. I have to give her credit. Her face was working, visibly working, recalculating, adjusting, but she didn't look away. What is it you want? She finally asked. I want my husband to look at me, I said. Elliot looked up. I want you to understand, I said to him, that I am not doing this to hurt you. I am doing this because for 2.5 years I have sat in this house and allowed your family to define what I was worth, and I let it happen because I believed that patience was a form of faith, that if I waited long enough, you would see what was actually there, that they would. I looked at him steadily. The document they put in front of me tonight, did you know about it? He looked at his hands. Elliot, did you know? They told me it was a formality, he said. His voice was quiet. That it was just to protect the family. That you'd probably understand if I explained it the right way. And you thought, I said, that the right way to handle it was to bring me here without telling me why. He didn't answer. That's what I thought, I said. Not with cruelty. Just with clarity. The kind that takes a long time to arrive and is very quiet when it does. Claire, Nadine started, then stopped. She had called me the wrong name. I didn't correct her. I'm going to say one thing, I said, standing up, and then I'm going to leave. Not because I'm running away, because I've said what I came to say, and there's no useful purpose in staying for dessert. I looked at Nadine. I don't have any anger toward you. I want you to know that, because I think you've been waiting for it, and I'd rather disappoint you cleanly. You looked at me and made a decision, and you made it before I walked through your door the first time, and nothing I did in 2.5 years was going to change it because you were never actually looking. That's not a character flaw. That's a habit. But it's one you might want to think about. I looked at Lawrence. The credit line issue can be resolved through your attorneys. I have no intention of using it as leverage. That's not why I mentioned it. I looked at Griffin. The Bar Association will handle their own process. I didn't do it to ruin you. I did it because it was the right thing to do. And also, since we're being honest, because you sat across from me and used a number as a weapon without checking what it was actually attached to. I picked up my bag. I looked at Elliot last. I'm going to the Whitmore, I said. That's the hotel in White Plains. Not because it's dramatic, but because I'm not driving back to Brooklyn tonight. If you want to have an actual conversation, not an Ashford family conversation, an actual conversation between you and me, you know where I'll be. I buttoned my coat. I'm still your wife. I want to be. But that's going to require you to decide something, and I can't decide it for you, and I'm done waiting in silence while you try to figure out which way the wind is blowing. I walked to the door. Behind me, I heard Lauren say something in a low voice. I heard Kendall say Griffin's name, sharp, like a sentence that had been building for a while. I heard Nadine say nothing, which was somehow louder than all of it. I kept walking. Outside, the December air was the kind of cold that clarifies things. No wind, just stillness and the particular silence of a large property after dark. My car was at the end of the circular driveway, where I'd parked it facing out. Old habit. I'd read once that when you park facing out, you're telling yourself you always have the option to leave. I sat in the car with the engine running for a moment, looking back at the house in the rearview mirror. Every window was lit. The Christmas tree was visible through the front room's bay window, 9 feet tall and decorated in white and gold, the kind of tree that exists to demonstrate that the people inside it do not have to make choices about what they spend. My phone buzzed. A message from my head of operations. She had found the Harwick documentation I'd asked for. Also, someone from Forbes had called again about an interview. I typed back, Monday on Forbes, and send the team a bonus this week. They held it together through a rough quarter. I thought about calling my mother. She would be awake. She was always awake late, a holdover from years of night shifts. She would listen to the whole thing without interrupting, and then she would say something that made the enormous parts of it manageable, not by making them small, but by putting them in the right order. She had a gift for that. I thought about Elliot, the first time I'd really seen him, not at the reception, but the morning after, at the hotel coffee station, when he'd been the only other person up at 5:30, and we'd stood in silence for a moment, and then started talking about something completely unrelated to the conference. Something about a book we both read, and I had thought, this is someone who is genuinely interested in the world. Not performing interest. Actually curious. I still believe that was in there. Underneath 2.5 years of Sunday dinners at that house, and the gentle, patient erosion of a family that loved him by teaching him to see everything through their eyes first. Whether he could find his way back to himself was not something I could do for him. I put the car in reverse and pulled out of the driveway. The last thing I saw in my mirror was the house growing smaller. Enormous and certain of itself. All those lit windows, the kind of place that has been in a family so long it starts to believe it's permanent. I watched it until the curve of the road took it from view. I didn't feel the way I had expected to feel. I had thought I would feel relief or vindication or the particular satisfaction of a thing finally said after years of being held. Instead, I felt something quieter. The specific stillness that comes at the end of a very long project. The kind of tired that is also, underneath it, a kind of peace. My mother used to say, "You can't make someone see you. You can only decide whether you'll keep standing in front of them." I had stood there for 2.5 years. I had said my piece. The rest of it, what Elliot chose, what the Ashfords did with what they now knew, what any of it became, was a different story. One I didn't have to write alone, but also one I didn't have to wait to be handed. The highway on-ramp was ahead. White Plains in 20 minutes. A hotel room with a door that locked from the inside, and silence, and the particular freedom of being somewhere no one expected anything from you. I drove. The thing I keep coming back to when I replay that Christmas dinner is the pen. The way someone had placed it beside that document like silverware. Like the decision had already been made and my signature was just a formality they were extending the courtesy of asking for. That detail tells you everything about how the Ashfords saw me. And in a strange way, it tells you everything about why things ended the way they did. Not because the universe was balancing a scale, but because the choices people make, repeated long enough, build the exact walls they eventually find themselves trapped inside. Nadine spent 2.5 years deciding I was a category. Lawrence never once asked what I built or why. Griffin used the number 43,000 like a scalpel, certain it would land. And none of them, not one, had thought to look. That's not a moral failure in the dramatic sense. It's a quieter one. The failure of people who stopped being curious because they believed they already knew. And the thing about stopped curiosity is that it doesn't stay still. It calcifies. It becomes certainty. And certainty, when it's built on the wrong foundation, becomes the exact instrument of its own undoing. I don't say that with satisfaction. I say it because I lived on the other side of it for years, and I had to learn something hard in that time, that staying quiet is not the same as being patient, and patience is not the same as wisdom. For too long, I confused the three. I kept my head down and told myself I was being the bigger person, when really I was just afraid. Afraid that if I spoke up, I would confirm what they already believed about me. That I was difficult, that I was grasping, that I didn't belong. What I know now is that the willingness to be honest, even when it costs you something, is not aggression. It's integrity. And integrity is not what you perform for people who are watching. It's what you do when the dinner table goes quiet, and the easy thing would be to pick up the pen. I had built Solace from a space heater and a studio apartment. I had run simulations at 3 a.m. and made payroll, and kept going when the math said stopping was reasonable. None of that happened because I was lucky or because things fell into place. It happened because I was willing to stay in the hard middle of something when everything around me said it wasn't working yet. That stubbornness. The kind that doesn't flinch, that keeps showing up, that refuses to let other people's conclusions become your own. That's the thing no one can hand you and no family name can manufacture. And what I hope, if you take anything from what I've told you, is this. The people who underestimate you are not your problem to correct in the moment. Your problem, your only real job, is to keep building the thing you believe in, with honesty, with rigor, with the kind of endurance that doesn't need an audience. Because the math always comes out eventually. You just have to still be standing when it does. I drove away from that house not knowing what Elliot would choose. I still don't know everything that comes next. But I knew, pulling onto that highway in the December dark, that I had told the truth, that I had not shrunk, that I had left nothing unsaid that needed saying. That was enough. That night, that was exactly enough.